What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and we've got another tournament report. I'm going to try and make this a weekly series because there have been a lot of DM era tournaments happening lately, and as I go into GX, there will just be more formats to cover. So I figure, this is probably a good weekly series just to get people caught up on the latest results in the retro Yu-Gi-Oh scene. So to start with, there were two tournaments that took place over this past weekend or over this past week that wrapped up and that I want to talk about here. There were some other tournaments as well in the GX era, but I haven't covered those formats yet, so I figure we can save those for some other time. But the formats that I do want to talk about today are Imperial and Critter, both of which had tournaments, and both of which had some pretty interesting results in the top cut. Now, for Imperial Format, let's talk about that first, because it was a much smaller tournament, only 19 people, but that was held in the YGO from Zero Discord server. Link is in the description down below if you want to join in the next monthly tournament for that, which will be in Cyber Format, which should be a lot of fun, which I should be getting to this week in coverage. But it should be a lot of fun, and if you do want to join that, the Discord's the best place to do so. Also, if you do like these videos, please do subscribe to the channel. It really does help out a lot, and I'd really like to reach 1,300 subscribers by the end of the month. But all that being said, we had an Imperial tournament. We had 19 people in it. It was a multi-day tournament, and it was in Swiss. So it's Swiss cut to a top 4, and that top 4 was made up of, well, actually, let's talk about the general deck type representation before we dive into spoilers for later. But as you can see, this tournament was relatively dominated by tomato control. However, this sort of graphic is a bit misleading because I know for a fact that certain decks that were not tomato control were classified as tomato control. So, and this is a problem that you get throughout the DM era, where the algorithm that sort of decides these things on Format Libraries coverage sort of lumps decks into tomato control if they are a bit too similar. And that isn't like any one person's fault or anything. It just is how it works. So, unfortunately, the results of this tournament on this graphic are a bit misleading here. There were a lot of tomato control decks, though. I don't want to sort of undersell the presence of that deck because it is a very good deck. It's basically just playing a bunch of good cards and playing 3 Mystic Tomatoes to get into Sangan with the Black Forest to search out your other good cards. So it's a very, very good deck in this format. It also gets board presence to stick a Jinzo on field, which is very good as well. So, very powerful deck, but the other two decks represented on this chart are Flip Control, which had 1 player, and Relinquished, which had 1 player. I assume the Flip Control list is more like a Hats Control style list, because I do know that 1 player was on Hats Control, which I did feature when covering this format way back when, and that's a really, really cool deck, so I was happy to see them run that back. And for the Relinquished, I think Relinquished is a very, very good deck in this format, and there were definitely more than just 1 person on this deck. I'm not sure why that 1 deck got classified as Relinquished. Maybe it was playing 3 copies of Relinquished, 3 copies of Black Illusion Ritual. But I do know that there were some other Relinquished lists that were playing less copies of that did make it to top cut. So let's dive into those topping decks now and discuss what I think of the format as a whole. So first, I mentioned that Relinquished did make it into top cut, and this is one of the lists. This was piloted by Food. It was the sort of 3rd or 4th place list, depending on how you count it. It got knocked out in the semifinals, facing another Relinquished deck, so unfortunately no Relinquished finals for the tournament, but it was a very, very cool deck list, and congratulations to Food for making it this far with this list. I think it's really, really cool. It's a bit different than the list that I showed off on my channel and that I managed to get second in the last Imperial Format tournament with, because it's playing 41 cards. It's doing some things a bit differently here, but I think this list is really, really cool. I think Relinquished is a very, very good deck in a format where a lot of flip monsters are very powerful, and you need some way to clear Jinzo. Relinquished sort of solves both those issues because it can suck up set monsters before they get their flip effects, and it can also suck up Jinzo as well. It does have major weaknesses into things like Imperial Order, but that's why Food's playing something like Dust Tornado, which can deal with Imperial Order, because generally you're less afraid of Jinzo than Imperial Order, and Jinzo and Imperial Order are the 2 major threats in this format. Most of the games that get lost are lost either to Io or Jinzo, and this deck does very well against Jinzo, not as much against Io. So, we've got the tech to deal with Io, but Jinzo is sort of dealt with by the main gimmick of the deck, which is Relinquished, which is just a very powerful monster. The deck also deck thins itself by playing Sonic Birds and Senju with 1,000 Hands, searching out your ritual spells and your Relinquished monsters as well. And also, it's sort of protect the castle style deck. Once you get Relinquished on field, you can protect with things like Solemn Judgment and potentially even Woboku's in the side here. So a very, very good deck overall. Only playing 5 cards in the Fusion deck, but again, the Fusion deck doesn't really matter in this format. It is technically an unlimited Fusion deck if you really do need to go into anything, but realistically, there's no way to bring these things out. But still, very, very good deck. It seems like they also had a 3rd copy of Relinquished in the side in case they need to bring it in, which is also a pretty cool innovation. But either way, this deck making top cut really does show that this deck has a lot of potential in this format, and there might be another deck in the top cut that does as well. Before we get to that deck, though, the other third place or fourth place deck list, depending on how you want to tally it, was piloted by Dump Truck, and that's Tomato Control. And this list is doing some very interesting things. The first and most obvious is Banisher of the Light, being a 2k defender that can banish your opponent's things when they're sent to the graveyard. Of course, this can also backfire and send your own things to the graveyard that way, or not to the graveyard, to the banish zone that way. But I do think it's a very powerful tech card in this format where Sangans, Witches, and Tomatoes are very, very powerful. You know, just preventing those from being in the graveyard and getting their powerful effect is very good. So I do like that tech. Also, Dump Truck was on the double Time Seal. I'm a bit less of a fan of this tech. I think Time Seal is kind of just underwhelming in general. It can be good. It can lock down certain games. But you don't really have anything like the Yadalock in later formats where you get that repeated value. The closest thing you can get is like flipping out Mask of Darkness, getting Time Seal back, and then reusing it. But that sort of combo has a limited sort of time limit on it because you can't just repeat that because you don't have Book of Moon, you don't have Tsukiyomi. You do have Magical Hats, which can set things down in the battle phase, but if your opponent go to the battle phase, then you can't do that. So yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of Time Seal, but the value it can get is pretty nice. It can sort of be like a Jar of Greed. You know, people go back and forth in Jar of Greed or Time Seal in a lot of these formats. And Time Seal deprives your opponent of a resource. Jar of Greed gains you a resource. And a lot of the time when Jar of Greed is available, people do play that. So Time Seal sort of fills a similar role. And I don't necessarily think it's bad to play. It's just a very underwhelming card to me. And I feel like there are a lot better cards that you could include here. But I don't hate the inclusion in this deck, but still very, very innovative deck list, and I think it's doing some very interesting things with Tomato Control in this format, and it definitely shows that Tomato Control has a lot of room for growth in this format. There's a lot of exploration that can be done here, even though people aren't the biggest fan of Imperial format by the whole. I do think that there is a lot to be done here, and so decks like this really do give me hope that people will continue experimenting with this format in the future. Moving into the second place deck list, we've got B-Sox piloting Relinquished here. B-Sox is indeed me, so I did put this deck list together. I'm pretty sure this was the same deck list that I used in the last Imperial Format tournament. I kind of just wanted to play Relinquished again, and I was like, well, you know, I don't really have too many complaints from my last tournament run, so I'll just play the same deck, and the same deck did very, very well. Now, it being the same deck, it did sort of give my opponents some information on, like, you know, what the exact ratios were, if they, like, figured out that I was just on the same thing. And there are some things that potentially change in the future. But I do think this deck is really, really, really good. I think that Relinquished is easily a tier 1 deck in Imperial format. It's had the tournament success to sort of prove that, in my opinion. Even though it hasn't managed to win an Imperial tournament yet, it's gotten second place 2 times. And I think that is a very good showing for the deck. And it's just very, very powerful. So I really do like the deck, and I think it's very, very good. I'm happy to see that Food experimented with it as well. But I really do just like this build a lot. There are some things that potentially change. For instance, in my finals match against Ratos, which unfortunately we couldn't get anyone to stream. And of course, I wasn't going to stream it because I was in it. I did find myself like lacking monsters at different points, but I feel like that's an issue that can come up in a variety of decks where you just don't draw into your monsters and then you can't really do anything. So I did encounter that flaw with the deck in that finals game. I didn't really feel that throughout the rest of the tournament, but it is something that can potentially come up, especially because these Relinquished aren't really actually monsters. And so you're only playing like from Mechanical Chaser upwards in the deck list here. But I do still think that the deck is very good, and I think that it is definitely tier 1. And I encourage people to play it. If you like Relinquished but have never really found a tournament where it's meta, then Imperial's format is for you. So very good stuff. And the side deck, I'd probably change a lot of. This is sort of like slapdash. You know, don't necessarily go off my side deck here. Maybe Foods is a little bit better. But I do think that, you know, no matter how you build the deck, as long as you're getting the main concept of the deck, which is just being a very grindy deck that sort of out-accrues its opponent in card advantage by deck thinning and also getting Relinquished to set up things multiple times, then you should be in a pretty good spot. However, Relinquished could not, at the end of the day, win the entire thing, and the tournament was won by a Ratos, a very good duelist in this format, and a lot of these older formats, and they actually managed to win the last Imperial Format tournament as well, facing the same player on the same deck, so they are very, very good in this format. And they brought a Tomato Control list, which is doing some very interesting things. You know, it's playing Cyberjar, it's playing Morphing Jar. A lot of people aren't necessarily playing these cards in their decks, but they can be very powerful if they resolve. It's also playing the Maneater Bug here. You can search that off of Witch or Sangan, so you don't necessarily need to play multiples of it, especially because Magician of Faith and your Jars are generally more powerful. But this deck is very, very good. It's also playing a Dust Tornado for the Imperial Orders as well, which is very nice too. So very good stuff all around here. Side deck is also looking really good. It's got the multiple man-eater bugs in case you need to bring in more. It's got Mass Sorcerer if you think that you can take advantage of that card. It's got Judgments. It's got Wishes for Burn. You know, there's a lot of very, very good stuff in that side deck too. So I think this list is a very, very slick tomato control list. And again, a very innovative one with the jars. And, you know, also it's playing Giant Social Stone instead of Banisher, when Stone is still very good in this format. So a lot of very interesting stuff going on. And I really do think it shows that there's a lot more to experiment with in this format. So I really do hope that people do take the time to try it out if it interests them. I think it's a really cool format that a lot of people sort of look down on. But I do think that with more interest and stuff, it could grow a larger community. Of course, moving into a format that does have a larger community, we dive into the Critters tournament here. Now, the Critters is a tournament series that is being held on Critterland, a Discord server devoted just to Critter, which will also be linked in the description down below if you do want to join in any future events. It's unclear whether they're going to hold their next one or if they are going to hold another one, but it was really cool to see this tournament pop off, and a lot of very interesting decks sort of rise to the forefront here. Now, again, just like with the deck type representation for Imperial format, there are some flaws with this graphic here. For instance, I know there are some decks that are listed as Muka Turbo that might realistically be listed as Labyrinth Tank Turbo instead. But I do think that still gives you an idea that this format, there's still a lot going on. And also, it is very important to note that there was no Exodia players in this format tournament here. So, you know, that's very interesting because Exodia has been a deck that's done well in the past and a very scary deck that a lot of people do tech out their main deck to deal with. But that's probably also why no one brought it, because they knew that people were prepared for it. And so they knew that they'd be at a disadvantage if they brought it. Now, this does mean that in future tournaments, if people do pivot away from that main deck hate, then maybe an Exodia deck will rise to the top again. But it also could just be a sign that the deck sort of passed its prime. That one event where it did top was sort of the time that it could actually shine. And now that people are prepared for it, it's a lot less good. But only time will tell with that sort of thing. As for the decks that actually did show up, there were 14 Mass Control players, 10 Muka Turbo players, and 1 player apiece of Catapult Turtle OTK and Labyrinth Tank Turbo. I think it does show that there's a mixture of different styles of play in this format. You know, Muka Turbo is much more aggressive, Mass Control is much more grindy and controlling. And you even have big OTK combo decks like Catapult Turtle that are running around too. So very cool to see the different lists on display here. We did have sort of a final stream showing off the finals match between two decks that were doing some very interesting things. And I do think that a lot of the deck lists were very fascinating and show that there's still a lot to explore in this format as well, even though it's been a lot more explored than something like Imperial. So very good sign for the health of the format as a whole, I think, because, you know, a lot of people, when they first started experimenting with it, it just seemed like Mass Control was going to be the main thing that was running around, and most of the top games would just be Mass Control mirrors. I think that this tournament really shows that that is not the case in Critter's modern iteration. Okay, diving into the top 8 deck list, let's start with Paolo NS's Mass Control list. This tied for 5th place, so it was knocked out in quarterfinals, I think they call it. But very, very interesting list here. It's a Mass Control list, but it's going hard in on Robin Goblin, so you could potentially call this a Hand Control list instead of a Mass Control list, especially because it's only playing 1 Mass Sorcerer. But we saw Robin Goblin see a lot of play in this tournament here, and it was very, very good a lot of the time. A lot of people are on Muka Turbo, and Robin Goblin really does hurt that deck if you're able to hit in for some damage there, because you can rip cards out of hand, make the Mukas weaker, and also this card is, of course, very good against Exodia as well. And there's some very interesting things that you can do with this card. For instance, you set like a Wall of Illusion, and your opponent attacked into it, then you can flip Robin Goblin, pitch a card, and then bounce a card, so then you can sort of switch the wall to attack and attack in to rip that monster out of hand, potentially next turn as well. And also, you know, the reinforcements here to win battle can help a lot as well, because you're sort of ensuring that your Robin Goblin goes through its removal as well. So very, very interesting stuff here. And also going all in on the 1800 beaters and some Mukas of their own. So that's good to know about as well. Also, of course, Karibo here, very interesting card, but it does make sense. Karibo is here to stop things like Mass Sorcerer from getting in for a draw, and thus keeping your opponent's hand size down low. It also is good for if your opponent's attacking in with something that can rip a card out of your hand. You can pitch Karibo, you're still losing a card, but you're choosing which card to get rid of, and you're getting rid of, honestly, probably the worst card in your hand. So, very, very cool stuff, very innovative list here, and definitely shows that Mass Control and Hand Control are definitely still works in progress in this format, and there still is a lot to explore, a lot of secret technology to discover. So this is awesome to see this sort of innovation here, but it's definitely not the only innovative list in this top cut. Moving from Mass Control to Muka Turbo, which seem to be the big two cards in this format. We've got this Muka Turbo list from Dump Truck here. Again, tied for 5th place, got out in quarterfinals, but still a very, very good list. Some interesting things to note here is that there is a 7 Tools of the Bandit in the main deck here to stop things like Solemn Judgment. That can be very powerful at insulating your plays and also punishing a major loss of life points on your opponent's part. Another interesting thing is the card destruction here. I generally don't like card destruction in Muka Turbo because it's a -1, and in a deck playing Mukas, you don't really want to have just -1s. But if you're playing Thunder Dragon already, this is a way to convert off the Thunder Dragon, so I do think that is very interesting. I've seen other Muka Turbo decks, including ones that I built, sort of try and convert off Thunder Dragons after your Mukas are depleted through things like polymerization to go into a twin head. And this is sort of a similar idea, except instead of going for a boss monster, it goes for digging deeper in your deck. And card destruction is usable outside of just if you have Thunder Dragon too. So I do think that this is a very good inclusion. Also, it does deal with Exodia too. So that is good to keep in mind as well. There's a white magical hat in here for that purpose too, but I do think it's interesting to see the card destruction here for sure. And beyond that, it's a pretty standard Muka Turbo list. And of course, there's some much spicier Muka Turbo lists in this top cut that we'll get to, but I think that if you are going for Muka Turbo, this is sort of a good standard list to start with. Although you might want to start with some of the more interesting lists that come a bit later in the top cut here. Moving from Muka Turbo into another Mass Control list, we're just ping-ponging back and forth between these two deck types. We've got Hoi on their version of Mass Control, and again, you could call this hand control. This deck is playing one Robin Goblin, but I would lean more towards calling this Mass Control, unlike Paolo NS's list, which probably should be called more hand control. But this list here is very, very cool. It's playing triple Masked Sorcerer, so it's going all in on the masked control part of things, but it's also playing very interesting suite of counter traps. Of course, there are the Solemn Judgments, which have been popular in this form in the past, but there's also triple Magic Jammer, which is very interesting. But it does make some sense. If you're going +1 off of a Masked Sorcerer, then you might have the discard fodder for this card. You've also got Thunder Dragons here to pitch off Magic Jammer too. So very, very interesting stuff from Hoi. They're also on the Wall of Illusion technology that, again, this sort of clears the way for your Masked Sorcerers to attack in. Also, if you're playing the Robin, then it can be very good in that regard too. So very, very cool list here. And also, they've got 7 tools on the side. They've got another Robin Goblin on the side. Also, double heavy on the side, choosing not to play heavy in the main deck to not shut off their own Robin Goblin, not shut off their own counter traps and stuff like that. So very, very interesting decisions for this list. But again, you know, this made it to the top cut here and does show that there are many different ways to build these mass control lists. And it's cool to see this innovation keep happening. For the last 5th place deck list here, we've got Aratos on their version of Mass Control here. And this is another, like, more standard list, but again, there's some very, very interesting things to note here. For instance, the 7 Tool of the Bandit, just like Dump Truck had in the main, along with triple Solemn Judgments here. So this allows you to really win the counter trap wars, which can be very, very important in the late game for this format. And it's definitely one of the most skill-intensive parts of this format is knowing when to go for all these things. But as we've seen from past Critter tournaments that Aratos has won or done very well in, they are a very skillful player. And so this sort of suite of counter traps can be very, very good for them. They are also playing a bit more of a standard list as well. You know, they're playing double Masked Sorcerer, so not quite 1, not quite 3, but double is generally good enough, especially when you have Witches and Sangans to search them out. They're also playing double Muka as well to get over their opponent's monsters. You know, they're playing a bunch of just very, very good stuff here. Although they're not really playing too much main deck hate for Exodia. They're playing the one white magical hat, which can be searched out off Sangan or Witch and get in for damage and a hand rip. But besides that, they're not really playing too much there. But they do have a bunch of stuff in the side. They can go more into a Muka Turbo deck list if they want to. They're playing 3 Thunder Dragon, a Muka, and double Last Will, which can sort of side into that. They're playing double card destruction in case they're up against sort of Exodia. They're also playing the Robin Goblins too. So very, very cool deck list here overall. And you know, again, this does show that there are many different ways to build the mass control list and a lot of different directions to go based on your playstyle and what you expect to be in the metagame. Moving on to the 3rd place deck list here, we've got Soul Emerald 69 on a really, really cool deck that I personally would probably call Labyrinthine Turbo if we're using that classification for things. I think it was officially classified as Muka Turbo, maybe because it's only playing double polymerization, or maybe because it's only playing 2 Cannon Soldier, 2 Gigatech Wolf, which are the fusion materials for Labyrinth Tank here. But I do think this is sort of following up on Falco's list from last Critter tournament that did very well, and sort of doing some interesting things with it. You know, not quite going all in on the Labyrinth Tank stuff. You know, again, only playing double Gigatech Wolf, double Cannon Soldier, That is enough to go into it sometimes, and oftentimes you're also going to be using Poly to go into things like Twin and Thunder Dragon, which is generally how I like to build fusion decks in this format, just sort of going into the twin-headed Thunder Dragon, adding as a form of extension a big body that's very difficult for your opponent out, and it's just very, very good if you can actually pull that off. And it's sort of played in a Muka shell, because what you do is if you do break on things like Poly or you've got the Thunder Dragons in hand, then that buffs up Muka. Although they are only playing 2 Muka, so, not going all in on the 3. Which makes sense because they probably didn't have the deck space to go in all in on the 3 here. But still a very, very interesting list overall. And it definitely does show that there is something to the deck that Falco brought to the last tournament. The sort of Labyrinth Tank Turbo deck that a lot of people looked at and were like, oh, there's a fluke that this thing topped. Why is this in the top cut? People must have gotten really unlucky. But a deck like this topping again shows that there is some merit to this strategy. And again, there are some certain things that can allow this deck to shine in the metagame. For instance, if Solemn is being played, Cannon Soldier can punish that. There aren't many decks that do extension in this format, and so if you can extend further, it can be very powerful. So this is a very, very neat list in my opinion. Also, 777 Tool of the Bandit to really punish Solemn players is very, very cool as well. And also to sort of insulate your big pushes with things like Twin Header, Labyrinth Tank, etc. So very, very neat deck list here. And I think it shows that this format is nowhere near solved. There's some more decks that can be experimented with and potentially see future tops in the future as well. For the other third place deck list, we've got Huntaru on Mass Control. Now, you could also, again, call this Hand Control because it is playing the Robin Goblins here, but the Robin Goblins don't really seem to be going, with too many other dedicated hand control cards, like there's no White Magical Hat, they're not playing Wall of Illusion, etc. So I do think it makes sense to classify this as Mass Control, although, again, the line can be blurry between these different deck distinctions. An interesting thing to note about this deck that's also playing Fake Trap to protect its Robin Goblins or to protect its other back row here. And that can be very, very strong if your opponent is just going for a heavy. Maybe they've got their own back row, but they're like, well, it's okay if I fire this heavy because I may lose my back row, but my opponent's losing theirs as well. If you flip up a Fake Trap, then, you are basically getting a lot of value off your opponent's heavy there. So I think this is a very, very interesting card to include here, and it does have a lot of different applications for this deck. You might want to protect your trap holes as well, your Solemns, etc. The one downside to Fake Trap is that it does telegraph to your opponent what you have, but sometimes them knowing it doesn't necessarily mean they can play around it. So, I do think this is a very interesting inclusion, and this list is really, really cool for a Mass Control list. I also want to note that this is the highest ranking Mass Control list in this tournament. Once we get into the top cut, the two players were not really playing Mass Control. And that is a very, very interesting thing to happen in a format that was really defined by this deck for a lot of its sort of retro exploration. So I'm not saying that this means that Mass Control is a bad deck by any means. I think it is still tier 1, but I do think it does show that Mass Control does not have a stranglehold on this format. There are still a lot of other decks that can do very well in these tournaments. So very, very cool to see this innovative Mass Control list take third place here, but also very cool to see no Mass Control in Top Cut. Diving into the top 2 list, we start with Falco's second place list here, which is, it was classified as Muka Turbo, which I can kind of get. It's playing triple Mukas and is playing, Last Wills to get out the Mukas, etc. But it's also playing things like Jirai Gumo, it's playing things like Crass Clown, Karibo, etc. So this is a very, very interesting list. Honestly, I sort of would classify this more just a beatdown list in general, because generally if you are playing things like Jirai Gumo, you're sort of going all in on the beatdown. But this is very, very neat. Now, Falco did say that they didn't really spend too much time making this deck. They sort of threw it together before the tournament began. And so there are potentially things that they would change in the future. But the fact that this still managed to get second place shows, first of all, how good Falco is as a player in this format, but also shows that there is some merit to this more aggressive strategy. I feel like people have really been labbing out control decks like Mass Control, etc. And Muka Turbo being on the rise has allowed them to sort of pivot into more beatdown exploration, but people haven't really gone beyond the sort of just triple Mukas, and they back it up with Masked Sorcerers and Thunder Dragons, etc. People haven't really divin into the sort of like Jirai Gumo, Dark Elf monsters and really brought them to tournament success. So I think the Jirai Gumo being here shows that maybe playing more of those in the future would be good. Now, that being said, I do want to provide a caveat to this, where in the finals match, which we did get on stream, we did see that some incorrect Jirai Gumo calls potentially cost Falco the game. And so this card does have a lot of drawback to it as well as some benefits. So that is very important to keep in mind if you want to play a deck like this for yourself. That being said, it is still a very powerful card. 2200 attack is nothing to scoff at in this format. And I do think that, this could open the way to people playing more beatdown strategies in the future. Also, I want to point out the Karibo tech is also being played in Falco's deck too. So maybe there is more to Karibo than people sort of gave it credit for in past exploration of this format. So very, very cool stuff from Falco here. Unfortunately, it was not able to take the entire thing. That was won by Yammerman. And Gomberman was also on a Muka Turbo list, and this is a much more standard Muka Turbo list. It's playing the triple Last Will, playing the triple Muka. It's playing things like Thunder Dragon. It's playing a Mass Sorcerer to draw deeper, but it's not relying overly much on Mass Sorcerer. So this is a very, very sort of very clean Muka Turbo list. It's not doing like too much to break the wheel, but it doesn't need to because it's a very, very powerful list, and it in the hands of a very good player like Yammerman, it can easily take some tournament success, and that's exactly what happened in this tournament. Some interesting things to note here is that in order to counter Exodia in the main deck, there is a Robin Goblin here. And that's the only counter to Exodia in the main. I generally like to have a White Magical Hat in the main to sort of counter it that way. But White Magical Hat can be very underwhelming, and Robin Goblin can be much better. For instance, if you're pairing it with things like Giant Soldier Stone, or if you're setting a Muka with a high defense, then, Robin Goblin can be very, very good there. And also, Robin Goblin has a bit more applications against other decks. And if you don't expect Exodia to be in a tournament, then you don't really need to be playing the White Magical Hat to sort of hate out that deck, right? And so Robin Goblin, I think, is a very heads-up play. You still have that out to Exodia if you really need it, but also it's just a very, very good card in this format if you manage to play it well. And it did manage to have a lot of success here. So very, very cool stuff from Yarman. And I think if you're picking up a Muka Turbo list, this is probably the list you want to go with. I think this will become the new standard Muka list for the foreseeable future. Not saying it's a perfect list by any means. There are, of course, adjustments you can make to it. And again, as I've been talking about over the course of discussing the decks in this tournament, I do think that, what you expect your opponents to bring will heavily dictate what you're bringing as well. For instance, if you expect more Exodia to be in the metagame, you might want to play things like Magical Hat in the main. If you expect more mass control, maybe you want to play things like 7-Tool in the main. And, if you expect Muka Turbo, maybe more Robin Goblins would be good. But I do think that this does show that Critter has a very healthy and thriving metagame. The fact that you can be able to make these meta calls and sort of adjust your deck to what you think is going to be brought, I think is a sign of when a format has really hit that sweet spot of having a healthy metagame where people have a good idea of what is good in the format, but people don't necessarily know the optimal lists, or people are still trying to figure out the tech to bring in to sort of tailor their deck to stop certain decks from being able to beat them. So I think that's a very, very good place for a format to be, and I'm really excited that Critter has reached that point. But that's going to do it for my coverage of the tournaments that wrapped up this week. Let me know what you think about these lists down in the comments below. Let me know whether you think this is a good sign for both the tournaments that I mentioned here, or whether you think that these formats are not really as good as I'm making them out to be, and that the results were actually disastrous for them. I generally look at these things with optimism, so I'm always happy to sort of see other perspectives as well. Again, if you like this sort of content, please do subscribe to the channel. And if you do want to support me directly, I do have a Patreon where you can sign up and you'll be shouted out in these videos. So big shoutouts to Tyler Compton, Rincewind, GMYFS, Dumbtruck, Porkchop Coon, and Bryn Donker, all for supporting me this way. It really does mean a lot to me, and it motivates me to make more videos like this in the future. So I hope you enjoyed this video as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from YJ from Zero, and I'm signing off.